right after the Supreme Court issued its ruling a couple of years ago in a case called United States versus Windsor, in which the Supreme Court invalidated provisions of the Federal Defense of Marriage Act, President Obama came out and he made a statement. He said, look, I'm not going to force, as President of the United States, I won't force any church to perform a same-sex marriage contrary to that church's teachings. And I thought, that's great. That's good to know. That would bother me if it were otherwise. On second thought, it occurred to me that's the kind of thing that probably doesn't need to be said.
That's right.
And in fact, so much so that it's a little alarming when it is said. If you run into someone late in the evening and there's nobody else around and that person says to you, you don't know this person, that person says to you, by the way, I just want you to know I'm not going to beat you up and rob you, that can be a little jarring. Because usually those kinds of things don't need to be said. If you're not going to beat someone up and rob them, you just don't have to say it, you just don't do it, and everybody understands. So the next thought that occurred to me was, if we get to the place in this country where all of a sudden religious liberty is being undermined and people are being targeted or treated unfairly on the basis of their religious belief about marriage, that retaliation, that targeting won't take place in the form of National Guard troops being mobilized and inserting themselves into a particular congregation, into a particular church or synagogue, saying you must perform this same-sex marriage. That's not really the way it would happen. The way it would happen would be that all of a sudden churches and other religious institutions and possibly individuals would start to receive discriminatory treatment of one sort or another. Churches might start to lose their tax-exempt status. Some charitable organizations with a religious angle might have the same thing happen to them. Some individuals might find themselves on the receiving end of retaliatory action by the government, either in the form of employment discrimination or in the form of a denial of access to a certain government program or certain government property. So that's why I came up with an idea that became the First Amendment Defense Act. And here's what it says in a nutshell. That the federal government, and no agency of the federal government, may take any retaliatory action against any individual or any group based on a religious belief that marriage is between a man and a woman. That means your church can't lose its tax-exempt status. That means your religious charity or your other charity can't lose any kind of tax-exempt status or other status based on this religious or conscience-based belief that marriage is between a man and a woman. In other words, it merely codifies what is already the law, what is already our current understanding, and what should properly be the law and the current understanding. The government has no business telling us what we ought to believe. Now, importantly, this law does nothing to undermine existing civil rights protections for any individual or any group. Any protection under state or federal law that would protect someone is not nullified by this. This just strengthens existing protections for religious beliefs. We have to remember that sometimes the government is not respectful of religious freedom. At times, this is the product of overt religious discrimination. The government's discriminating against people because it either doesn't like people of faith generally, or it doesn't like people of a particular faith, or it disagrees with this particular belief, tenet, or practice, or teaching of a particular faith. In other circumstances, the government is merely clumsy. It acts with reckless disregard to our religious liberty. I sometimes analogize it to Godzilla. When Godzilla steps on your house, it's not necessarily automatically the case that Godzilla hates you in particular, or that he's chosen you in particular as his lunch. It might simply be because he's Godzilla, and he's huge, and he's clumsy, and your house is in the way. But regardless of the reason, we've got to make sure that Godzilla, the big Godzilla of government, can't, won't, doesn't step on your religious freedoms. You know, it's been said that if India is the world's most religious nation, and if Sweden is the world's least religious nation, then the United States of America can be analogized to a nation of Indians governed by Swedes. We as a people are believers. We believe in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, even the Lord Jesus Christ. And we will not be deterred by our government in worshiping in the manner that we see fit, or in believing according to the conscience of our own heart, in worshiping and believing according to our own reading of Holy Scripture. It's my hope and it's my prayer that we can put this protection in place. With your help, we can, but I do need your help. So please join me in this effort. Thank you very much. I've got a question of what will it take? Well, we'd have to get it passed in both the House and the Senate. Right now in the House of Representatives, we have 140 original co-sponsors, and that's very good. We need to keep getting more co-sponsors. In the Senate, we've got, I believe, about 25 co-sponsors, and we need more. The biggest thing that we need is we need people talking about this. We need people contacting their senators and their congressmen, telling them about the First Amendment Defense Act. If you want details on it, you can go to my website at lee.senate.gov, where you can find the latest text of the bill. And if you like what you see, and if you like what you've heard today, I'd encourage you to contact your senators and your congressmen, and please tell them to support this, to support it right now by joining on as original co-sponsors. And then tweet about it, Facebook about it, anything you can on social media and through letters to the editor. There's misinformation going on about this bill, and we need to help counteract it. Yes, sir.
Do you have a breakdown of the bill that we can break it down from in a lay way?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes. We've got at my website lee.senate.gov. We have, in addition to the bill text, which is relatively simple as far as bills in Congress go. It's only a few pages long, but in addition to that, we have brief bullet point explanations that put it in layman's English.
Would you identify yourselves to the senator before, because a lot of bishops are in the room, Senator, you have some real friends here, and so I'd just like for them to let you know the strength of what they're bringing. And so maybe your affiliation and your state would be very helpful for him to see that we're from all over the country to support his initiative.
From Los Angeles, Bishop Frank Stewart. What are some of the evidence that perhaps you already see that may oppose this bill?
Okay, a great question. The New York Times ran an editorial, not just an op-ed, but a Times editorial on Sunday. And the headline of it read something along the lines of, the First Amendment Defense Act backers are motivated only by anti-gay bias. And nothing could be further from the truth. There's nothing about this that would undermine the rights of any American, regardless of their sexual orientation. There's nothing about this that is based in any kind of bias. This is allowing Americans to live and let live, to live and worship as they see fit, and to protect our own freedoms. As far as other pieces of evidence, so that there was the New York Times editorial. I think there was a post on Newsweek online a few days ago. There have been a few others. In addition to this, right after the Supreme Court issued its ruling earlier this year, in the Obergefell case, in which the Supreme Court invalidated all state laws that embraced traditional marriage, and basically mandated that every state recognize same-sex marriage. Almost immediately, you started seeing open calls for the removal of the tax-exempt status of churches, in particular churches that refuse to recognize same-sex marriage. And it's just not right. This long-standing tradition, this dates back not just years or decades. This dates back many centuries. It dates back 800 years at least to the Magna Carta, where we have, in many hundreds of years of Anglo-American legal tradition, we understand that we need to keep churches and governments separate. And part of that means that we don't let governments tax churches. And so we've got to resist this with every fiber of our being. And I think it's also important to remember that we have to simultaneously maintain the protection for both the group, meaning the church or the religious organization or the charitable foundation or whatever it is, and the individual. If we split the two up, that's bad. Because your religious freedom means more than just what you exercise as a group, as a corporate entity that is your particular parish, your particular congregation. Yes, ma'am.
I heard the chaplain of the Senate once, Lloyd Ogilvie, say that the intent of the First Amendment was to protect religion from the state, not the state from religion. Did I say that right? And I didn't realize that, and it seems like it's been turned around, and we're trying to protect the state from religion rather than keep the state out of it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Is exactly right. So the First Amendment has two provisions that relate to religion. One is the Free Exercise Clause, which on its face is there to protect your individual religious liberty against the government. And then we have the Establishment Clause, the purpose of which at the outset was always to protect the right of the states to establish whatever state religion they wanted. Now, no state today would do that. It's kind of an anachronism. We don't do that sort of thing anymore. But meanwhile, a group of federal judges have commandeered the Establishment Clause and started to use it in order to try to drive religion out of the public square altogether, away from government and everything else. And it's bad. If you're interested in this, there's a great analysis of this in a book I wrote called Our Lost Constitution, came out a few months ago. I have a whole chapter devoted to this very issue, explaining how the original understanding and meaning of the Establishment Clause was changed about 60 or 70 years ago by some devious jurists who just wanted to try to purge religion from the public square altogether. Yes, sir.
Just two more questions. So I saw these two hands, so that's it. Sorry, everybody else.
Yeah.
So in Texas, they passed a pastor's protection bill to try to protect us from having to perform same-sex unions. The question I'm asking is, will this bill that you're working on protect us from having to do same-sex premarital counseling or allowing people to join our marriage ministry who are in a same-sex marriage, those type of things? What kind of protections do we have to keep us from being litigated against when we say we don't believe a same-sex couple should be in our marriage ministry or we're not going to provide premarital counseling for this couple?
Yes. So this law would protect you from any kind of retaliatory action by the federal government against you from doing that. And let me explain what the limitations on that are. So that means neither the IRS nor any other federal agency could take any adverse action against you for doing that, for refusing to perform a same-sex marriage or engage in counseling or things like that for same-sex couples. It does not deal with state law, and so that's why I would encourage every state to adopt a similar mechanism. We don't have jurisdiction over the state governments the same way we have jurisdiction over the federal government. So just as Congress needs to pass the First Amendment Defense Act, I would hope that every one of the 50 state legislatures would adopt corresponding state legislation that could be based on the First Amendment Defense Act, and I'd encourage them to do that. Already, Louisiana has put in place protections like these by means of an executive order. And I'm told that there are a number of states that are considering legislation, but I hope and expect this will become a trend.
No, there was only one more, and I already saw Bishop Hunt. They've already given me.
Bishop Hunt from Georgia.
Thank you.
And we're in the midst of trying our best to get RFRA in Georgia. So, of course, it's been attacked in many areas. So, of course, I want to first applaud you because we really need this to go through. But everyone's concerned about the votes. What can we do in this case, even if there would be a potential veto? What do you feel like we can do to really help this go through the process that politically it looks kind of bleak?
Okay, great question. The thing that works better than anything else for politicians is to just give people adequate incentive to support it and a fear of not supporting it. And by fear, I don't mean fear for their physical safety, but the more people hear from their constituents that they need to support something, and the more they hear about how reasonable it is from voters in their state, the more inclined they'll be to support it, and the more they will be fearful of not supporting it, because they'll understand that those who oppose it are not friends of religious liberty. Even though they may profess devotion to religious liberty with their lips, their hearts are far from it. To paraphrase the words of Isaiah, unless they're supporting legislation like this. And so It's why there really needs to be a grassroots campaign for people to start contacting their senators and their congressmen. Because make no mistake, there will be a lot of pressure on the other side. My colleagues, Republicans and Democrats, are already getting lots of calls from lots of people. Most of it is based on misinformation. Of people saying that this is somehow bigoted against against people who are fans of same-sex marriage, or at least bigoted somehow against gays and lesbians, and it just isn't true. The bottom line remains that this doesn't undermine anyone else's freedom. It only protects our religious freedom as Americans from being undermined by the government. This doesn't restrict the behavior of any individual, moreover. It restricts only the behavior of government. And that's the most important kind of legislation to have. There are varying levels of discrimination. There are different reasons why people discriminate against each other, and different entities that engage in discrimination. In my mind, the very nastiest form of discrimination, whether it is carried out on the basis of race or gender or religious belief or anything, is that type of discrimination that is sponsored and executed, carried out by the government. That is dangerous. Because where you've got an individual who's acting against you in a discriminatory, unfair fashion, you can always find ways to avoid that individual. But when it's the government, especially something as powerful as the federal government, an entity that collects and spends $4 trillion a year, this is an overwhelming force. And that's why we have to carefully constrain the force of government so that it can't be used against us to our detriment and to the detriment of our eternal souls. Thank you very much. May God bless the United States of America.